In the late 19th century, as America emerged from the ashes of the Civil War, a quiet and meticulous man was building something the world had never witnessed, an empire so vast, so penetrating, so absolute, that it redefined the very rules of capitalism. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, and his creation, the Standard Oil Company, was not merely a business. It was a system, a mechanism of economic control so ingenious that its structural principles still govern how corporations operate, how markets function, and how power concentrates in the hands of the few. When Rockefeller died in 1937 at age 97, he had accumulated a fortune equivalent to approximately $400 billion in today's values, making him arguably the richest man who ever lived. But the money was merely the visible symptom. Rockefeller's true legacy was invisible. He created the blueprint for the modern monopoly, for vertical integration, for horizontal consolidation, for strategic philanthropy, and for the corporate capitalism that dominates the 21st century. This is not simply the story of a wealthy man. This is the story of how a system was forged and why you still live inside it. John Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York, the son of William Avery Rockefeller, a traveling salesman of fake medicines and notorious con artist, and Eliza Davison, a deeply religious and disciplined woman. The duality between the opportunistic father and the austere mother shaped John's character. He inherited William's ruthless cunning and Eliza's Protestant discipline. From a young age, Rockefeller displayed an unusual obsession with numbers, control, and efficiency. At 16, he secured his first job as a bookkeeping assistant in Cleveland, Ohio, earning 50 cents a day. He recorded every penny spent in a small notebook he carried with him, a habit he would maintain throughout his life. This accounting meticulousness was not mere greed, it was a philosophy. Rockefeller saw the world as a system of flows, money coming in, money going out, and profit as the mathematical result of maximum efficiency. In 1859, when the first commercial oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania, Rockefeller was only 20 years old. But he perceived something that speculators obsessed with drilling could not see. The real money was not in extracting oil from the ground, it was in refining it, transporting it, and controlling it. The American oil industry in the early 1860s was chaotic. Hundreds of small producers drilled wells, refineries sprouted without coordination, prices fluctuated violently, and the market was dominated by disorganized speculation. Rockefeller viewed this chaos not as a problem, but as an opportunity. In 1863, at just 24 years old, he and several partners founded an oil refinery in Cleveland. While other players in the sector focused on rapid expansion, Rockefeller concentrated on operational efficiency. He studied every detail of the refining process, eliminated waste, negotiated aggressive discounts with railroads, and meticulously reinvested every penny of profit into the operation itself. In 1870, Rockefeller founded the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, which began with 10% of the American refining market. What followed was one of the most brutal and ingenious corporate consolidation campaigns in history. Rockefeller's strategy had three main pillars: vertical integration, secret agreements with railroads, and forced acquisition of competitors. Vertical integration meant controlling every stage of the production chain. Rockefeller was not content with merely refining oil. He purchased pipelines, tank cars, warehouses, maritime shipping companies, and even wooden barrel factories. By owning the entire infrastructure, he eliminated middlemen and reduced costs to levels impossible for competitors. But the masterstroke was his relationship with the railroads. Rockefeller negotiated secret agreements that guaranteed him massive discounts on oil transportation, sometimes up to 50% below the rates paid by his rivals. Even more extraordinary, he received rebates not only on his own shipments, but also on competitor shipments. In other words, every barrel of oil that a competitor shipped by rail directly financed Standard Oil. This system created a death spiral. The more competitors sold, the more money Rockefeller accumulated to destroy them. And destruction was exactly what he did. Rockefeller approached rival refineries with a simple and terrible proposition: sell your company to me at a fair price, or I will destroy you. Those who refused faced relentless price wars. Standard Oil sold kerosene below cost in local markets, absorbing temporary losses that smaller competitors could not sustain. When rival refineries finally went bankrupt, Rockefeller bought them for a fraction of their value and consolidated more power. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled an astonishing 90% of oil refining in the United States. Chaos had been replaced by order, Rockefeller's order. But this extreme concentration of economic power was beginning to generate political and social resistance. Journalists, politicians, and smaller businessmen denounced Rockefeller as an octopus strangling free competition. The legal structure of Standard Oil was also problematic. It operated as a federation of state companies that technically could not own shares in one another. It was then that Rockefeller and his lawyers created a revolutionary legal innovation, the trust. In 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was established, allowing a central board of trustees to control the shares of all associated companies. This structure not only consolidated operational control, it created a new model of corporate organization that would be copied by countless industries. The trust became the prototype for the modern holding company, the transnational corporation, the integrated conglomerate. Rockefeller had not merely dominated oil, he had invented the institutional architecture of 20th century corporate power. And as he continued expanding his empire, consolidating even more control over transportation, refining, and distribution, the forces that would eventually challenge his system were beginning to organize. But the system Rockefeller created was already deeply rooted in the American economy and in the global capitalist imagination. By the mid-1880s, John D. Rockefeller had achieved what no industrialist before him had accomplished. He had transformed a fragmented, volatile industry into a centrally controlled machine of profit generation. The Standard Oil Trust was not just dominant, it was omnipresent. It touched every aspect of American life that required illumination, lubrication, or energy. Kerosene lamps in homes across the nation burned Standard Oil fuel. Factories relied on Standard Oil lubricants. The company's blue barrels became as recognizable as the American flag itself. But this unprecedented concentration of power came with an equally unprecedented problem: public fury. As Rockefeller's empire grew, so did the voices demanding its dismantlement. Farmers, small businessmen, and populist politicians rallied against what they called the octopus, a creature with tentacles reaching into every corner of the economy, strangling competition and extracting wealth from ordinary Americans. Ida Tarbell, an investigative journalist whose father had been ruined by Rockefeller's tactics, began publishing a devastating series of articles in McClure's magazine in 1902 titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. Her meticulous documentation of Rockefeller's secret railroad deals, predatory pricing, and corporate espionage turned public opinion decisively against him. Rockefeller became the face of everything terrifying about industrial capitalism: cold, calculating, monopolistic, and seemingly above the law. Yet Rockefeller himself remained largely silent throughout these attacks. He rarely gave interviews, avoided public appearances, and maintained an almost mystical detachment from the controversies swirling around him. This silence was strategic. Rockefeller understood that engaging with critics would only amplify their message. Instead, he focused on what he did best: optimization, expansion, and control. Even as political pressure mounted, Standard Oil continued to grow more efficient, more profitable, and more entrenched. The company's economies of scale were so massive that even partial competitors struggled to survive. Rockefeller had created a system where size itself became an insurmountable competitive advantage. A smaller refinery might match Standard Oil's technology, but it could never match its purchasing power, its distribution network, or its ability to absorb temporary losses in price wars. The system was self-reinforcing. Dominance created efficiency, efficiency created profits, and profits funded further dominance. This was not merely a monopoly in the traditional sense, it was a new form of economic organism, adaptive and resilient, capable of surviving attacks that would destroy lesser enterprises. The political backlash, however, could not be ignored forever. In 1890, the United States Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal legislation designed to combat monopolistic practices and preserve competition. The law was deliberately broad, prohibiting every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade. It was clear to everyone that Standard Oil was the primary target. But translating legal language into actual enforcement proved extraordinarily difficult. Standard Oil's lawyers were among the best in the nation, and they had spent years constructing a corporate structure specifically designed to be legally ambiguous. When Ohio courts ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Trust in 1892, Rockefeller simply reorganized the company under a new structure. The various Standard Oil entities became ostensibly independent companies, but they remained coordinated through interlocking directorates, shared ownership, and informal agreements. The substance of control remained unchanged, only the legal appearance shifted. For more than a decade, this arrangement held. Rockefeller had discovered something profound. In the battle between economic power and political power, economic power had structural advantages. Politicians came and went with election cycles. Public attention was fickle, but capital was patient and institutions were durable. The turning point came in 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency following William McKinley's assassination. Roosevelt was unlike previous presidents in his willingness to use federal power aggressively against corporate monopolies. He believed that unchecked corporate power threatened democracy itself, and he was prepared to make Standard Oil the test case for federal authority. In 1906, the Roosevelt administration filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, initiating what would become one of the most significant legal battles in American history. The case dragged on for years, involving thousands of pages of testimony, forensic accounting, and legal arguments. The government's case was straightforward. Standard Oil had systematically eliminated competition through illegal means, creating a monopoly that harmed consumers and violated federal law. Standard Oil's defense was equally clear. The company had achieved dominance through superior efficiency, and its actions had actually benefited consumers by lowering prices and improving product quality. Both arguments contained elements of truth. Rockefeller had indeed created efficiencies that lowered costs. Standard Oil's kerosene was cheaper and more consistent than what had been available in the chaotic early days of the oil industry. But these benefits had come at the cost of eliminating meaningful competition and concentrating economic power to a degree that many Americans found intolerable. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil in a landmark decision. The court ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Trust, breaking it into 34 separate companies. These included entities that would later become some of the largest corporations in the world. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York, which became Mobil. Standard Oil of California, which became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana, which became Amoco. And Continental Oil, which became Conoco. The decision was hailed as a great victory for antitrust enforcement and democratic capitalism. The octopus had been slain, or so it seemed. But the reality was far more complex, and in many ways more troubling. The breakup of Standard Oil did not destroy Rockefeller's wealth, it multiplied it. Because he owned substantial shares in all of the separated companies, and because these companies continued to thrive as independent entities, the total value of Rockefeller's holdings actually increased dramatically after the breakup. Within a few years, he was wealthier than ever. More importantly, the fundamental logic of the system Rockefeller had created remained intact. The separated companies still dominated their respective markets. They still benefited from the infrastructure, the technical knowledge, and the business practices that Rockefeller had pioneered. And over subsequent decades, many of these companies would merge and consolidate again, reconstituting much of the power that had supposedly been broken apart. The Standard Oil case established important legal precedents for antitrust enforcement, but it also revealed the limits of legal remedies against entrenched economic power.
You could break apart a monopoly's corporate structure, but you could not easily undo the economic efficiencies, the technological advantages, or the institutional knowledge that had enabled its dominance. The system was deeper than any single company. Rockefeller had not just built a business empire, he had demonstrated a way of organizing economic activity that proved remarkably difficult to dislodge. Vertical integration, economies of scale, strategic control of infrastructure, sophisticated financial engineering. These were not tactics unique to Standard Oil. They were techniques that could be applied in any industry, and they would be. In the decades following the Standard Oil breakup, similar patterns of consolidation would emerge in steel, telecommunications, automotive, banking, and eventually technology. Each new generation of industrialists would rediscover and refine the playbook that Rockefeller had written. By the time of his death in 1937, Rockefeller had already transcended his own biography. He was no longer just a man, but a symbol of wealth, of power, of the possibilities and dangers of capitalism itself.
As Rockefeller aged and gradually withdrew from the day-to-day operations of his business empire, he turned his attention to a project that would prove almost as revolutionary as his industrial achievements: the systematic transformation of American philanthropy. Before Rockefeller, charitable giving in the United States was largely haphazard, driven by personal sentiment, religious obligation, or social pressure. Wealthy individuals gave to churches, orphanages, and local causes without much strategic thought about long-term impact or systemic change. Rockefeller approached philanthropy the same way he approached business, with meticulous planning, rigorous analysis, and an obsession with efficiency and scale. He did not simply want to help people, he wanted to solve fundamental problems at their root, to create self-sustaining institutions that would continue generating benefits long after his death. This approach, which became known as scientific philanthropy, would reshape how wealth relates to social good, and it remains the dominant model for major foundations to this day. In many ways, Rockefeller's philanthropic legacy is even more enduring than his business empire, because while Standard Oil was eventually broken apart, the institutions he created to give away his fortune continue to shape education, medicine, and scientific research more than a century later. Rockefeller's philanthropy began in earnest in the 1890s, guided by his chief advisor, Frederick Taylor Gates, a former Baptist minister who brought both moral vision and analytical rigor to the task of giving away vast sums of money. Gates convinced Rockefeller that random acts of charity were wasteful, and that truly meaningful philanthropy required the same systematic approach that had built Standard Oil. Together, they identified areas where strategic investment could produce transformative results. One of their first major initiatives was the founding of the University of Chicago in 1890. Rockefeller ultimately donated more than $80 million to the institution, an astronomical sum at the time. But this was not merely writing checks to an existing institution. It was creating a world-class research university from scratch, modeled on the great German universities but located in the American Midwest. The University of Chicago would become one of the premier centers of academic excellence in the world, producing more Nobel laureates than almost any other institution. This was Rockefeller's vision of leverage. Rather than funding hundreds of small schools, create one institution of such excellence that it would elevate the entire field of higher education through competition and example. The second major focus was medical research and public health. In the early 20th century, diseases like hookworm, yellow fever, and malaria ravaged populations across the American South and in tropical regions worldwide. These were not merely health problems, but economic catastrophes, rendering entire populations too sick to work, learn, or develop. In 1901, Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which would become Rockefeller University, a pioneering center for biomedical science. Scientists there made groundbreaking discoveries in virology, immunology, and molecular biology. But Rockefeller's most ambitious health initiative was the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission for the Eradication of Hookworm Disease, launched in 1909. This program deployed teams of physicians and educators across the rural South, treating infected individuals, teaching sanitation practices, and building infrastructure like proper latrines. Within a few years, hookworm infection rates plummeted, and entire communities experienced dramatic improvements in health, productivity, and quality of life. The program demonstrated that strategic, well-funded interventions could effectively eliminate diseases that had been considered inevitable facts of life. This model of philanthropic intervention, identifying a solvable problem, applying scientific expertise, and scaling the solution systematically, would be replicated in dozens of countries through the Rockefeller Foundation's International Health Division. In 1913, Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Foundation with an initial endowment of over $100 million. The foundation's charter was breathtakingly ambitious: to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Unlike traditional charities focused on immediate relief, the foundation invested in long-term solutions, funding scientific research, building educational institutions, and tackling root causes of poverty and disease. The foundation played crucial roles in developing the yellow fever vaccine, advancing agricultural productivity through the Green Revolution, and supporting the arts and humanities. It established medical schools in China, funded public health campaigns in dozens of countries, and trained generations of scientists, doctors, and public health professionals. The scale and sophistication of these efforts were unprecedented. Rockefeller had essentially created a parallel global infrastructure for addressing human problems, one funded by private wealth but operating with the scope and ambition of a government. This raised profound questions that remain unresolved today. Is it appropriate for private individuals, however well-intentioned, to wield such influence over public goods like health and education? Does strategic philanthropy genuinely serve the public interest, or does it extend and legitimize the power of wealthy elites? Can institutions funded by monopolistic capitalism truly address problems created by that same system? Critics at the time and since have argued that Rockefeller's philanthropy was fundamentally self-serving, designed to rehabilitate his reputation and deflect attention from the predatory practices that built his fortune. There is certainly truth to this. Rockefeller was acutely aware of his public image, and his massive charitable giving undoubtedly softened perceptions of him. Where once he was reviled as a robber baron, he gradually became celebrated as a generous benefactor. The transformation was so complete that by the time of his death, newspapers eulogized him as one of history's great humanitarians. But reducing Rockefeller's philanthropy to mere reputation management misses something more significant. The institutions he created genuinely saved lives, advanced knowledge, and expanded opportunities for millions of people who had no connection to Standard Oil or the controversies surrounding it. A child cured of hookworm in rural Georgia, a student educated at the University of Chicago, a farmer in Mexico benefiting from disease-resistant wheat varieties developed with Rockefeller Foundation support, these people experienced real improvements in their lives regardless of Rockefeller's motives. The uncomfortable reality is that philanthropic impact and problematic origins can coexist. The money that funded life-saving medical research was extracted through monopolistic practices that harmed competitors and consumers. The same ruthless efficiency that crushed rivals also created the wealth that eradicated diseases. What makes Rockefeller's philanthropic model so enduring and so troubling is that it established a template for how extreme wealth relates to social good in capitalist societies. The pattern is now familiar. Accumulate vast fortunes through aggressive, often ethically questionable business practices, then give substantial portions away through carefully managed foundations that address social problems without fundamentally challenging the economic system that created the wealth in the first place. This model has been followed by virtually every major American philanthropist since Rockefeller: Andrew Carnegie with libraries and education, Bill Gates with global health, Mark Zuckerberg with education reform. The Rockefeller Foundation itself continues to operate more than a century after its founding, with an endowment in the billions and programs spanning the globe. Modern critiques of billionaire philanthropy, arguing that it allows wealthy individuals to set public priorities without democratic accountability, that it treats systemic problems as technical challenges rather than political struggles, that it preserves and legitimizes inequality even as it addresses some of inequality's symptoms, would all be recognizable to Rockefeller's contemporary critics. The system he pioneered persists because it serves multiple functions. It does genuine good, it manages the social legitimacy of extreme wealth, and it channels potentially disruptive fortunes into carefully controlled institutional forms. Rockefeller understood intuitively what later scholars would articulate explicitly, that in a capitalist democracy, private wealth needs social justification, and strategic philanthropy provides that justification while preserving the fundamental structure of wealth and power.
The final decades of John D. Rockefeller's life were spent in quiet seclusion at his estates in New York and Florida, far removed from the boardrooms and battlefields where his empire had been forged. He had officially retired from active business management in the late 1890s, though his influence remained pervasive through the executives and systems he had put in place. By the 1920s and 1930s, as he entered his 90s, Rockefeller had become a living relic of a bygone era, the last surviving titan of the Gilded Age, a bridge between the rough capitalism of the 19th century and the corporate managerialism of the 20th. He spent his days playing golf, corresponding with advisors about philanthropic initiatives, and meticulously tracking his health with the same attention to detail he had once applied to refinery operations. He was obsessed with longevity, employing personal physicians, following strict dietary regimens, and famously giving away dimes to children and strangers as a quirky gesture of goodwill. These dimes became legendary, a strange humanizing detail about a man who had once been portrayed as utterly inhuman. When he died on May 23, 1937, at his home in Ormond Beach, Florida, he was 97 years old and still one of the wealthiest individuals on earth, despite having given away hundreds of millions of dollars. The newspapers that had once demonized him now ran respectful obituaries praising his business acumen and philanthropic contributions. He had outlived most of his critics, survived the breakup of his company, and successfully transformed his legacy from robber baron to benefactor. But the real measure of Rockefeller's impact is not found in his personal biography or even in the specific institutions he created. It is found in the structural template he left behind, a way of organizing economic power that has proven extraordinarily adaptable and resilient across more than a century of change. The fundamental techniques Rockefeller pioneered have been applied and refined in industry after industry, often with even greater sophistication than he achieved. Vertical integration, the strategy of controlling every stage of production from raw materials to final sale, became standard practice in 20th century manufacturing. Henry Ford applied it to automotive production. Tech companies like Apple apply it today, controlling hardware, software, retail distribution, and even component manufacturing. The efficiency gains Rockefeller demonstrated remain just as compelling now as they were in the 1870s. Horizontal consolidation, the absorption of competitors to achieve market dominance, continues through mergers and acquisitions that create ever larger corporate entities. The logic is identical to what drove Rockefeller to buy out rival refineries. Size creates advantages that smaller competitors cannot match, and dominance becomes self-reinforcing. Contemporary examples are everywhere: Amazon dominating retail, Google controlling search, Facebook absorbing Instagram and WhatsApp to maintain social media hegemony. Perhaps most significantly, Rockefeller demonstrated that the key to durable corporate power is not merely market dominance but control of essential infrastructure. Standard Oil's greatest advantage was never its refineries, but its pipelines, railroads, and distribution networks. Whoever controlled the infrastructure controlled the industry, regardless of who produced the underlying commodity. This insight has been the foundation of corporate strategy ever since. In the early 20th century, AT&T controlled telecommunications not by making the best telephones, but by owning the network that connected them. In the late 20th century, Microsoft dominated computing not by making the best applications, but by controlling the operating system on which applications ran. In the 21st century, technology platforms like Amazon Web Services, Google Search Infrastructure, and Apple's App Store wield power by controlling the digital infrastructure through which others must operate. The players change, the technologies evolve, but the underlying strategic logic remains Rockefeller's. Identify the choke point, control the infrastructure, and dominance follows. This is why contemporary debates about platform regulation, net neutrality, and antitrust enforcement echo the debates about Standard Oil more than a century ago. The tactics have become more sophisticated, the legal structures more complex, but the fundamental dynamic is unchanged. The integration of philanthropy into corporate capitalism, too, has followed Rockefeller's model with remarkable fidelity. The modern landscape of billionaire-funded foundations, impact investing, and corporate social responsibility all descend directly from the strategic philanthropy Rockefeller pioneered. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the Omidyar Network. These organizations mirror the Rockefeller Foundation in structure, scale, and ambition. They apply business principles to social problems, they invest in systemic solutions rather than immediate relief, and they operate with minimal democratic oversight despite wielding enormous influence over public priorities. The criticisms are also the same, that private wealth should not determine public goods, that philanthropy preserves inequality while addressing its symptoms, that strategic giving allows billionaires to shape society according to their personal preferences rather than collective democratic decisions. Yet the model persists because it offers something valuable to everyone involved. Donors receive social legitimacy and tax benefits, recipient institutions receive funding that governments cannot or will not provide, and beneficiaries receive genuine assistance even if it comes with strings attached. The system is stable precisely because it distributes benefits widely enough to maintain support while preserving the fundamental concentration of wealth and power that makes it necessary. What makes Rockefeller's legacy so inescapable is that he did not merely succeed within an existing system, he created the system itself. The modern corporation, with its complex organizational hierarchies, its separation of ownership and management, its focus on shareholder value and quarterly earnings, its integration across multiple business lines, its global supply chains and distribution networks, all of this bears Rockefeller's fingerprints. The antitrust laws created to constrain his power have been weakened, reinterpreted, and selectively enforced over subsequent decades, often by courts that embrace the economic efficiency arguments Rockefeller's lawyers pioneered. The massive foundations that shape global health, education, and development policy operate on principles Rockefeller established. The very idea that extreme wealth accumulation is socially acceptable if paired with strategic giving, this too is Rockefeller's legacy. Even the critics who challenge contemporary inequality and corporate power operate within frameworks shaped by the battles fought over Standard Oil. The vocabulary of monopoly, trust-busting, robber barons, and corporate accountability all emerged from the Rockefeller era and continue to structure how we think about economic power today. In the end, Rockefeller created something more enduring than a company or even a fortune. He created a logic of capitalism that has become so deeply embedded in economic institutions, legal frameworks, and cultural assumptions that it feels like nature rather than choice. When contemporary corporations pursue vertical integration, when they leverage infrastructure control for competitive advantage, when they use scale to crush rivals and then frame dominance as efficiency, when billionaires establish foundations to address problems their own wealth accumulation helped create, they are not copying Rockefeller. They are operating within the system he built. This is what makes his legacy so powerful and so difficult to escape. It is not imposed from outside, but has become the internal logic of capitalism itself. You cannot opt out of it because it is the structure within which opting happens. The prices you pay, the products you buy, the infrastructure you depend on, the institutions that shape your health and education, all of these bear the imprint of organizational principles and power dynamics that Rockefeller pioneered. He is not merely a historical figure whose influence has faded with time. He is the architect of the economic world you inhabit, the designer of systems you navigate daily without recognizing their origins. More than a century after Standard Oil's breakup and nearly 90 years after Rockefeller's death, you still live in the world he made. And that, more than any fortune or monument, is the measure of his true power. A system so comprehensive, so normalized, so essential to modern life that it has become invisible even as it shapes everything. John D. Rockefeller did not just build an empire. He built the blueprint for how empires are built, maintained, and justified. And that blueprint is still in use today.